It was nice to have Jeff Kupfer here today from ConservAmerica. This is an organization that has put together some really groundbreaking research talking about the impacts of the American Clean Energy Tax Incentives. And we had a really thoughtful conversation about how that research is being used in Washington at such a pivotal time. And Jeff had a lot of really terrific thoughts to share.
What I appreciate is we've had conversations like this on the podcast before, right? With our friends at ACC and just talking about the bipartisan nature of this work and how there are more and more voices speaking that language. But I thought what was interesting about ConservAmerica's approach is that they're coming at it from an economic impact lens, and like the data that they're providing is grounding these conversations in reality of federal policy leads to market decisions by private sector company leads to impacts to the American people and to the American consumer. And so I think that's just we need to be having more of those conversations in Washington that are grounded in economic reality. And so leaning on partners like ConservAmerica to provide that context, I think, is going to be more and more important as we get deeper into these negotiations.
Right, because no matter your politics, no matter where you start and stop on the political spectrum, everybody cares about the cost of their utility bill every month. And their data showed something like $152 increase on a regular basis for American consumers. And that's huge.
Yeah.
Affordability, reliability, business certainty are all elements of the data that they put forth. And those are key topics when it comes to the work that we're trying to get done on Capitol Hill to make sure that our members can keep their doors open and the industry continues to grow.
Jeff, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate you spending some time with us. Would love to get started by talking a little bit about what ConservAmerica is and what you do. You obviously have a really good perspective on sort of the confluence of conservative ideology and the environmental issues and energy issues. And we'd just love to hear a little bit about how that all came to be and what your organization does.
Glad to be here with you today. ConservAmerica has been around for a couple decades, actually. It began as a group called Republicans for Environmental Protection back in the late 90s. And it was a recognition that Republicans primarily, but conservatives as a general matter, have been involved in conservation and environmental issues for a long time, and that there was some sense at that time, and I wasn't around when the organization was founded, but that it sort of lost their way a little bit, and that it was important to get back to those roots and to continue the traditions that had been there for decades before, whether that goes all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt and the national park system, or even Ronald Reagan, who talked about our responsibility to pass on to future generations the lands and the earth that we inhabit. So it was this idea that conservation is something that's conservative. To conserve is actually something that's a fundamental principle of politics and of people who care about these issues. And so that was the genesis of the organization, and then it's been around in different ebbs and flows over the years.
What kinds of things do you produce?
One is, to the extent that we think that there's a need for white papers or analysis or anything else on issues of the day, we try and put those out. To the extent that we think it's important to get op-eds or sort of advocacy pieces out there, we do that as well. And it's really a two-pronged approach. One is that we want to highlight some of the things that our partners in this area are doing. We think that's important to show that there are members of Congress who care about these issues and that are doing things proactively to try to address them. And so we want to highlight them, but we also want them to know that when they when they push on these different issues or when they advocate for them, that there's groups out there that have their back and that are willing to stand up and say, you know what, that was a good idea and that was a legitimate thing to do.
Before we dive into some of the some of your recent work. Would love to just hear about sort of your story and how you found your way to this organization. You've got a career in public service, and you've spent a lot of time in energy issues, but sort of what landed you at ConservAmerica?
So it's true. I've been around in the public policy space for a long time in a variety of different positions. And after leaving the Hill, I worked in the George W. Bush administration for a number of years, ending up at the Energy Department, where I was the chief operating officer, the chief of staff, the acting deputy secretary, and all sort of different iterations. And then And when I was there, one of the things that we thought was really important was to talk about a diversity of energy sources, a diversity of approaches, a diversity of supply, everything along those lines. Kind of a general all of the above approach that we should care about. Our energy security and energy security, economic security go hand in hand, but also that we have a responsibility to produce that energy in an environmentally sustainable way. So that was just sort of the ethos of how we operated. Since that time, I worked in the private sector, was working for one of the companies that helped to develop the Marcellus Shale, which helped to really change the country's energy situation in terms of natural gas. And then from there, also began to do some work. I taught and still do teach an energy policy class. And it's a long way of saying with all that, I've continued to be engaged in these issues. And when the opportunity to be involved with ConservAmerica came up, I thought it was really important to do for some of the reasons that I mentioned before in terms of why the organization came about. It was seeming more and more at the time, and this was about 5 years ago, that energy was really and environmental issues were really becoming politicized, that it was either you were kind of cared about these issues, in which case you were somebody who was associated with some of the environmental organizations, or there was a perception that if you weren't sort of on the far left and that you were supporting everything that was going on at the time, Green New Deal, some of those things, that you just didn't care about this suite of issues. And I'm not the only one, but a number of us felt that wasn't the case, that there are people, organizations, policymakers who care about these issues. And so we thought sort of revitalizing ConservAmerica was an important contribution to the country's political dynamic, energy dynamic, and environmental dynamic.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. I think there's a general consensus in some circles that if you're supportive of clean energy, you must be a liberal, but that's absolutely not the case. Every day we talk to a lot of conservatives, we talk to a lot of Republicans, more Republicans than Democrats, actually, to maintain our coalition of folks that are helping us protect, defend, and uplift the solar industry. So I'd love to dig in for a second into some of the headlines. What do you think the sort of top line for your latest research says about the impacts of repealing some of the American clean energy
tax incentives? I'll back up and talk about why we did it at first. And it's pretty clear that with President Trump taking office and a Republican-controlled Congress, that the provisions that had been passed in the Inflation Reduction Act were going to be looked at again. I mean, it was just natural, partly because of the way the IRA passed, which was a clear partisan bill, and just in terms of the vote. So you knew it was going to be a target. And then also you get a new administration, they're always going to revisit things. So that's the undercurrent that we knew was out there. We also know that when President Trump came into office, he talked about a few different things. One was unleashing American energy, and two was trying to deal with higher costs for the American people, and whether that's inflation or just general growth in costs and everything else. So those are the principles that he comes into office advocating for. You also have the IRA that you know is going to be looked at. And we thought, okay, if that's going to happen, we want to make sure that Republican members, all members of Congress, but since it's going to go through reconciliation, primarily Republican members, have a good basis of what the facts are that are out there so that they can make decisions. They have a lot of competing priorities. I mean, this isn't just one can't just look at the IRA and the those tax provisions in a vacuum. They're going to have to be dealing with rates, state and local tax deductions. I mean, a whole myriad of other things that have nothing to do with energy or the stuff we're talking about. And we just wanted to make sure that when they went into that process and they were sitting around in that room deciding what to do, that they had the facts, that they understood what was going on out there on the ground. And so that was why we partnered with the Brattle Group to do an economic analysis of removing the clean energy tax credits. And we don't know if that's going to be the case, but we thought it was important to at least set out what would happen if those credits all go away in the next year or so. That was the rationale for doing the report.
Yeah, it's important.
Yeah.
So tell us, what did you find?
Okay, so what the report found was two things, I guess. I mean, it was a number of things, but sort of two major points. The first one is, unlike what we've seen in previous years, over the last few years, it's clear that electricity demand in the country has been going up and will continue to go up. And I'm sure that's something that your listeners are well aware of, and people across the country are starting to realize that. But for a long time, that was not the case at all. The pie was staying the same, or arguably going to shrink over time. So what the Brattle Group did was help to put some numbers on that growth in demand. And by 2035, the U.S. is going to need to produce at least 50% more electricity than what we're producing today. And, at certain peak levels, it'll be even higher than that sooner. So they found that, and that's due to a number of factors, which one never knows. It's hard to predict, especially in today's environment, what's going to happen. But the factors that they saw going into that increased demand are ones that are pretty clear that they're going to continue, whether it's data center usage and AI, whether it's reshoring American manufacturing, whether it's the electrification of industrial processes, and even in certain parts of the country, the electrification of drilling for oil and natural gas. I mean, drilling rigs that used to run on diesel are increasingly running on electricity. So for all those reasons, electricity growth is going to happen. And the question is, where are you going to meet it, and what's the most readily available resources to do it? So they helped to lay out that baseline, and then they said, okay, if the credits go away, what's going to happen? And as you would expect, there are a number of ramifications. It's on average across the country, electricity bills are going to go up by over $80 per household, and over $150 in certain regions of the country that are more dependent on some of the renewable sources. They found that solar and wind and storage would be much less built than it would if the credits continued, that there would be job losses around the country, and that there would be a hit to the economy if all of those credits go away. So that was kind of the overall picture that they found. And what we also thought was useful is they were able to drill into particular states and say, okay, here's what it would be in this state versus other state, because as you know, the resources aren't uniform across the country.
It's interesting because we were at Sarah Week in Houston a few weeks ago, and obviously the entire narrative throughout the week was AI and increased energy demand. And we talked a lot about speed of deployment, because if the only way that we're going to remain competitive globally is if we're able to actually deploy quickly. I wonder if there's anything in your data that talks about speed, that talks about solutioning in that regard, given the supply chain limitations that the other sectors are faced by.
Right, and I was at Sarah Week too. I guess we didn't actually run into each other down there, but
next year. There's always next year.
Exactly, but it's always an interesting gathering, and one of the things that I was struck with, besides what you mentioned about the AI, and can't even tell you how many sessions, as you know, were focused on AI and electricity demand, was there was a lot of discussion about natural gas and how important it will be in going forward, which we all agree with as an organization. I mean, we've been for all of the above, and
so are we, by the way.
Yeah, and
might surprise you.
No, I think that's great. Supportive of all different forms of energy, all different sources that we need, but the reality is that the natural gas supply chain for turbines is just going to take some time. Now, people can say, well, that's because, in previous years it was frowned upon for natural gas, and so the orders weren't coming in and capacity wasn't there, and that's all legitimate. But just as we sit here today and we look at reality, it's going to take a number of years for that supply chain to begin to ramp up again. Also, we're very strong supporters of nuclear power, both if it's existing nuclear plants that are going to be extended or brought out of mothball status. I mean, that's fine, and small modular reactors as well. But once again, the timetable to do that is going to take a while, and different people may have different views, but even the SMRs are into the 2030s. And so the question is, okay, what's dispatchable now? What can we do right now to help meet the demand, which is rising dramatically? And what the report, I think, pretty clearly articulates is that solar, wind, and storage are the most readily available resources to meet that demand. And it goes through a whole slew of numbers about what the timing would be to bring all those online. But that's, I think, a key takeaway of what we've seen. So even if you don't care about cleaner forms of energy, shall we say, or if you don't care at all about emissions or any sort of environmental implications of energy production, even if that doesn't matter at all, and all you were cared about was let's just get as much on the grid as quickly as we can, it leads back to those renewable resources that have been in development, partly because of the IRA, but partly because of state policies and everything else over the years. And so they're there. Mm-hmm. So let's take advantage of them for those reasons of needing to increase supply and meet the AI challenge.
Yeah. So in the week since putting this data out there, what has been your perception of the reaction to it? Have you had good conversations with folks about how this is resonating? Is it kind of do you feel like this is changing the narrative a little bit around where we should be focusing our efforts on meeting that demand, and kind of how is this changing the conversation?
I think it's I don't know if I could sit here and claim that it has dramatically changed the narrative. I think it's been a helpful addition to a discussion that was and is ongoing, which is just to bring a finer point to what we've just been talking about in terms of the electricity demand and where it's going to be met. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's really important. The more studies, the more voices that can help to articulate that, I think is important, because policymakers need to understand that, or should understand that. In terms of how it all shakes out, I think is still an open question. I mean, these members are facing a lot of really tough decisions over the next few months. Mm-hmm. And the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act are going to get adjusted. I would think one way or mm-hmm. another. Mm-hmm. How they actually get adjusted, I think, is still an open question. So I think policymakers are very appreciative of what we're putting out there. There hasn't been any pushback in terms of the numbers and the general conclusions that are on the table and that we're articulating. I think that's something that folks understand. But how that fits into these hard decisions that the members are going to have to make, we'll see. The members who signed House Republican members, or 21, who signed a letter that said, hey, think about affordability, think about reliability as we go into this process. All of those members and others who we talk to certainly understand the narrative that we're just discussing. I think they're all in different places about where they would put some of these on the priority list, which is understandable.
Yeah.
They got a lot to juggle.
Yeah.
I find it certainly additive, 100% additive, because at the end of the day, like you said, the letter from 21 House Republicans, the Garbarino letter, it's had a ton of power over the last few weeks, and I think it was 14 or 18 before the end of the year. It's carried them through their conversations with the speaker, and it's been tremendously helpful in helping us to defend these tax credits. We certainly expect that some of them will go away, but the key ones that will help the industry continue to grow are okay for now.
Right.
So it's good to have voices like yours out there supplementing what we've been talking about and giving those Republicans something more to use in those conversations. So I'm so happy to have anything more that we can sell to on the SIA side, because we're constantly sharing new data, sharing new content to our audiences. And I think having a conservative voice in the mix is tremendously helpful.
Right. And, one of the points we've made over time is one of the principles of conservatism, and one of the principles of our organization is to rely on market-based policies to do it, and also to have business certainty. It's just something that is important in any sort of government policy. It doesn't mean government policy shouldn't change, and plenty of them do over time. But regardless of whether one was supportive of how the IRA came into being, the fact is it's now been here, and the tax incentives have been here for a number of years. Businesses have made decisions based on what was in the law. They've begun to hire people. They've made investments. There's jobs and everything else that are out there. And so you have to think really hard before you're going to change what a business has relied on to do something. And that's the argument that I think we can help to articulate as an organization more so than others.
Right. And the IRA worked. The goal is to create a domestic manufacturing renaissance here in the United States. It worked. For the first time in ever, we can create enough domestic supply to meet demand in the U.S. Solar with solar capacity. I don't know that anybody expected that when the IRA passed a few years ago.
Yeah. Well, and I also just want to circle back to what you talked about when laying out sort of the rationale for doing this work, which was looking at the mandate that this administration and this Congress came into Washington with, which was addressing affordability issues for the American people. And so I think tying this analysis back to that and showcasing that these credits are protecting energy affordability for most Americans, and that sort of upending this policy mechanism would increase costs for average Americans. That's the kind of discussion that I think needs to be happening, and we have to bring it back to the solution that we're trying to provide, or the solution that we're trying to present. And I think too often it gets caught up in this question of like which energy source should win. But at the end of the day, we know that these policies have worked, and we know that they're like lowering costs for American consumers. And so I think that's really an argument that resonates with a broad spectrum of people, right? The business certainty and the keeping costs low for average Americans. Who couldn't support that?
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, and I think that's important to lay it out there. I mean, the caveat that we always say as we discuss this, and what we hear back from different members as we talk about this is, sure, even if we take your analysis that it does keep costs low, It does cost the government money,
Sure.
obviously, to have these incentives in place. And if we have a certain amount of money that we can spend on everything that we're going to do as part of our upcoming reconciliation bill, we're going to have to balance this on this hand with rate reductions or other things
Right.
on the other hand. And we'll see how that plays out. But we think it's important to put the data out there so that they can at least make a informed decision about how that all comes together. As I think back on this, one really you can't rewrite history, but the durability of policy is always something that we try to focus on. And to the extent that we had a more bipartisan approach to doing it, I think it would be in a much different place right now. When you look at some of the other provisions of the IRA that had historically had a little bit more sort of bipartisan angle to it, they're less controversial right now, I would say, as we go through this reconciliation process. So I think it's just a lesson for all sides that if you want to try to keep things in place over time, trying to pick up as much bipartisan support as you can and do it in a bipartisan way is the best way of doing it.
And that's the dream, right? When I came to Washington 25 years ago, there was decorum.
Right.
Right? The Orrin Hatches of the world worked with the Tom Dashiells of the world to get things done. It's just not the same today.
Right.
And I live for the day that we have some version of that again in Congress.
Right. No, not to date myself, but I worked on the Senate Finance Committee back in that era as well. So
yeah,
wouldn't that be great?
Different time.
Different time.
Yeah. Well, this has been really helpful, Jeff, and really, really appreciate the work that y'all are doing to share this information and again, present a different side of the story, I think, to policymakers and those in positions of influence. So keep it coming. We appreciate it.
All right. Well,
Thank you.
Glad to be here. Thanks.